I'm going to talk about some of the trends affecting energy markets over the next 25 years out to 2040. Many of you have been to presentations on the energy outlook before. To remind you, the main reason why we produce the energy outlook is to help our own internal planning and our own internal strategy. One of my responsibilities at BP is I'm part of a group that is responsible for thinking about the long-term strategy of the company. And we use the energy outlook to help do that and formulate that strategy. Now, at this point, many of you may be thinking, I'm now very worried about BP. If I have some BP shares, I should rush out and sell them. BP thinks it can predict the future. That's a very worrying thing. We know we can't predict the future. We know that any forecast will be wrong. The value of a forecast is not to try to predict the future, but rather to try to better understand the uncertainty you face. So in this energy outlook, we look at a whole range of different scenarios. Each one of these lines here is a different scenario, and don't worry now about understanding what each of them does, but the idea is we do a whole series of what-if statements. What if the world banned internal combustion engine cars? What if the world stopped switching away from coal into natural gas? What would that do to natural gas demand? What if the world carried on supporting renewable energy at the levels that they are doing so today? How will that change and shape the energy outlook? And by doing that, we can gradually, slowly build up an idea about the uncertainty we face. And so for a company like BP, I think of a resilient strategy or a robust strategy is a strategy that does quite well across a whole range of different states of the world. We won't base our strategy on trying to predict the future. We'll base it on understanding the range of uncertainty we face and try and pick a scenario that does quite well. So that's the reason why we produced this document. An interesting question is, well, why do we publish it? If it's so valuable to BP, why don't you just keep it to yourselves? And that way you'll be smarter than other people. And I think the reason why we publish it is because we know we're not smarter than everybody else. One of the biggest dangers any company faces, any danger any government faces, is groupthink. You all sit round a table, you agree with each other. Even if you don't agree with each other, you're too scared to tell your boss you don't agree with them, and you go along a particular course. If you stand up in a room of 150 people, many of whom know far more about energy markets than you do, they will tell you what's wrong with what you're saying. I've been to this institute enough times now over the last 3 or 4 years to know that nobody here is shy in telling me which bits they are wrong. And in doing that, as I get on the plane tonight, I will write up all the things I have learned, and I will go back to London a smarter person than I arrived in Moscow a couple of days ago. And so that's why we publish this, is because the best way of challenging our thinking is to open it up for peer review and to understand better what's going on. And so I hope the Institute will continue its tradition of holding me to account and challenging me when I stop today. When we look at thinking ahead over the next 25 years, the key thing which is happening in energy markets is this significant energy transition, the shifting in the pattern of energy demand and the shift in the composition of those energies towards cleaner, lower carbon fuels. What we've done this year is to better understand that energy transition. We've looked at the same forces through 3 different windows or 3 lenses into the same picture. So one of them we look at in terms of how that energy is used, so which sector is using that energy. If energy demand is rising for the industrial sector, that will have very different implications for the fuel mix than if it's rising due to increases in transportation. And the nature of those trends over time will be different. Likewise, we then look at where that energy is growing. If energy is growing in China, the implications of that for the fuel mix are again very different to the implications if it was growing in India, say. And then we look at the fuels themselves. And so I won't have time to go through all the details of the book today. For those of you who picked up one, you can see there's 100 pages, and it would make for a very dull presentation if I tried to take you through all of those. But hopefully the plan is to try to whet your appetite enough that rather than, as you leave, throwing the book in the bin, you take it with you and then you sort of look at it in a little bit more detail. The charts I showed you today, I'm showing you here on this presentation, and in this slide, are for one particular scenario. It's what we call the evolving transition scenario. And the evolving transition scenario is designed to try to give you a sense of the path that global energy markets are on if government policies, technology and preferences continue to evolve in a speed and manner seen in the recent past. So if you like, in a loose sense, what path are we on absent a shock to technology or a shock to policy? There will be shocks to policy and technologies that they're happening every day. So this is not what I believe will happen. It's one particular scenario, but I'll use that as a way of sort of trying to anchor my narrative today. And then I'll show you how the world would look different under various what-if types of conversations. So in the evolving transition scenario, energy demand continues to grow. This is energy demand just looked at through those three prisms. Energy demand grows by about 30% in the evolving transition scenario out to 2040. That's an average growth rate of a little less than 1.5% a year. It's about 1.3% a year. For those of you who aren't familiar with these growth rates, that's the average growth rate over the last 20 years is a number close to 2% a year. So global energy demand continuing to grow, but growing less quickly than in the past. If we look at these windows in a little bit more detail, if we look at the where sector, where is this energy growing? All of the growth in energy demand is coming from developing economies, led by China and India, with China and India each accounting for around a quarter of the growth in global energy demand over the next 25 years in the evolving transition scenario. The green bars on the left here shows you the level of energy demand in the OECD, in the developed world. That is flat. Those economies will continue to grow, but they will continue to make improvements in energy efficiency, so their overall demand in energy is likely to change very little. All of the growth is coming in developing economies. What drives that growth in the developing world is increasing prosperity. When you think about economic growth can depend on only one of two things. Most things in economics are very simple, and economic growth is one of them. Either more people or those people becoming more productive. The only way output can grow is either you have more people or those people producing more output. In China, population growth has already peaked. It is already declining. All of the growth in China is coming from increasing productivity. In India, population growth is still growing, but the vast majority of the economic growth is coming from increasing productivity. Why does this matter? Productivity measures output per head. If output per head is growing, it means income per head is growing. What drives economic growth and what drives global energy over the next 25 years is increasing prosperity. We think something like 2.5 billion people, that's a third of the world's current population, will move from low incomes to middle incomes over the next 25 years. As the world moves from low incomes to middle incomes, they can start to have access to electricity. They will start to be able to buy household appliances. They can save up and buy their first motorbike. Then they can save up and buy their first motor car. That is what's driving global growth of energy demand over the next 25 years. In that sense, this growth of global energy demand is a good news story. that is enabling this increase in global living standards. And for those of you who are involved in any sort of retail, if they're involved in downstream energy markets or involved in any type of downstream business more generally, you'll know if you're selling to a market which is growing because the people are getting richer, that's a very different marketplace to a market where you're growing just because there's more people. And this is a world, not just in energy but globally, across all the industries, where the market is getting bigger because the world is getting richer. And that's a good news story to say. You can see on the chart on the right here, if you compare the dark blue of China with the light blue of India, China continues to dominate energy growth over the next 10 or 15 years, but it seems likely as the pace of economic growth slows in China and that economic growth becomes less energy intensive, India is likely to emerge as a major source of energy demand growth in the last 10 years or so of the outlooks. So it's shifting in the order, or the changing of the guards, if you like, with India emerging as a major source of energy growth. If I go back to my three windows and just briefly look at the fuel and how the energy mix is likely to change, we think by far and away the fastest growing source of energy over the next 25 years will be renewable energy. For renewables here, that doesn't include hydro. I've modelled hydro separately in blue. So renewable energy here is wind, solar and biofuels. Renewable energy today in a global system only accounts for around 3% of global energy. But we think the pace at which that will grow, it will account for something like 40% of the growth in energy over the next 25 years. Allowing its share to rise from around 3% today to almost 15% by 2040. Astonishingly strong growth in renewable energy. Natural gas, shown here in red, we think will carry on growing far more quickly than either oil or coal. And as you can see here, it overtakes coal to be the world's second largest energy source in the mid-2020s in the evolving transition scenario, and converges on oil by the end of the outlook. Natural gas in this scenario is accounting for around a third of the growth of energy. So renewable energy and natural gas together accounting for around 3/4 of the growth in primary energy over the next 25 years. So a significant shift to cleaner, lower carbon fuels in the form of natural gas and renewable energy. And that growth in natural gas underpinned by broad-based demand, continuing supplies of low-cost gas from Russia, particularly from the US, also from Qatar, and the growing development and continuing growth of LNG, meaning that gas around the world becomes more and more accessible. Oil demand in this particular scenario continues to grow for much of the outlook, but at a slowing pace. And I'm going to come on to talk a little bit about peak oil demand. What do we think about peak oil demand? How should we think about it? And I'm going to try and tell you two stories. I'm going to try and say two things about peak oil demand. A, I don't know when oil demand will peak. And B, frankly, I don't care when oil demand will peak. And I'll see if I convince you of those two things in a moment. The other story here is coal, where you're seeing this sharp decline in the share of coal. This is consistent with the level of coal demand in this outlook being essentially flat, so zero growth in coal. And that reflects two contrasting parts of the world. OECD economies and China having quite sharp falls in absolute levels of coal consumption, so reductions in the level of coal consumption in those economies, offset by continuing growth of coal consumption in India and Southeast Asian economies as those economies continue to grow, and the need to find cheap, accessible power for their growing populations and their growing wealthy populations have increased. And those two things net off such that overall coal demand looks broadly flat. But within this scenario, it seems increasingly likely that coal consumption in China has now peaked. I think when we get the most recent data, when we get data for next year, we may well see that coal consumption picked up a little bit last year, but is very unlikely to get back to the high levels it saw in 2013 and 2014. And I think when history of climate and climate change comes to be written, the peaking in Chinese coal consumption will be an important part of that story. One feature of this evolving energy mix is I think the world is moving towards the most diversified fuel mix the world has ever seen. Now, the special thing about this chart is it starts in 1900, so it's the only chart with some history. But the point of the history is to remind you that if you look back in history, the energy system has typically been dominated by a single fuel. For much of the period post the Industrial Revolution, the world was dominated by coal. As coal declined, the 1970s saw the emergence of oil as a dominant source of fuel. But the growth of both natural gas and renewables relative to coal and oil means we're moving to a world where we think coal, oil, natural gas and non-fossil fuels will each account for broadly similar shares of global energy. Why does this matter? I think it matters because it's part of the forces which are leading to a far more competitive global energy system. And I think that increasing competitiveness has three components to it. First is the one I mentioned earlier, which is global energy demand continues to grow, but it's growing less quickly than the past. So the pie that we were competing for, although growing, is growing less quickly. So that's one part of the competition. Secondly, within each fuel, there's an increasing abundance of supplies, leading to increasing competition within fuels. An obvious example of that at the moment is the competition between OPEC, Russia, and US tight oil for shares within the oil market. The competition within natural gas between Russia, US shale gas, and Qatar is equally as competitive. So increasing competition within fuels. Added to that, this diversified fuel mix is consistent with increasing competition across fuels as well. The most obvious place where this competition plays out is in the power sector, where these fuels compete alongside each other side by side. But if you look at the transport sector, you'll see an increasing competition for oil in the transport sector by both electric vehicles and also by natural gas as well. So increasing competition across fuels as well as within fuels. What does this mean? For companies like BP, we may well carry on investing, and I'll say a little bit more in a moment about carry on investing in oil and investing in gas, but just having resources is not sufficient now. You have to make sure that those resources are low cost, competitive resources to make sure that you're able to compete in this increasingly competitive marketplace. And I think for countries, if you're a country that had very large resources of energy 20 or 30 years ago, that was pretty much a guarantee that you and your society could enjoy a relatively prosperous life for the foreseeable future. That's no longer the case. There's an abundance of energy. Much of that energy will never be used. And so the competition now is to make sure that your energy is lower cost and more competitive than other sources of energy, to make sure that your assets get monetized and other assets don't. And so I think a key part of the evolving energy mix is its increasing competition and increasing competitive forces which are driving it. That's a very brief overview of some of the themes coming out. And as I said, my plan, rather than to give you the 4-hour version of this lecture, is to just give you the 40-minute version of the lecture. But hopefully it will encourage you to take the book away and look in a little bit more detail. What I thought I have sort of 5 questions which I was going to try and order my thoughts around today. So first of all, about electric cars and shared mobility. So electric cars, autonomous vehicles, shared mobility. What is happening there. Secondly, when will oil demand grow? That's the peak oil demand. Do we care? Does it matter? When will that happen? Say something about LNG and developments in LNG. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly of all, is the energy system developing at a pace consistent with hitting the Paris climate goals? And finally, a few observations of what this may mean for Russia and some of the patterns we're seeing in terms of the Russian outlook. Now, depending on how carried away I get as I go through this presentation, I may not get to all 5 of those questions, but we'll get through the first 2 or 3, and then we'll see how we're doing for time and see if we can have time to do all of them or whether we just have to drop 1 or 2. So I want to start with the what have we learnt about electric cars and the mobility revolution. I framed it in terms of what have we learned to sort of reflect the fact we are still learning here. A lot of this analysis on electric cars and autonomy is new. Our understanding has changed quite a bit from the last year and is likely to change again when I come back and see you next year. So if you like, this is where our thinking's got to so far, and I'm more than happy for people in the Q&A to say, I don't think that's very good, Spencer, and you should be thinking more in this space or that space. So this is where our thinking has got to so far. The first bit where we have changed is, I think almost all the discussions that any of you may have had about electric cars, about how quickly electricity will penetrate, has focused on the number of electric cars. There's about 3 million electric cars on the planet today, and almost all the discussions that I have been involved in until recently was just trying to guess what that number would be. Would that number be 300, 400, 500 million electric cars by 2040? Instead, we think there's a better way of thinking about the penetration of electric cars. Okay, so I thought this was going to be a build, that's okay. Rather than thinking about, I'm looking at the left-hand side here, rather than thinking about the number of electric cars, think about the share of miles driven by cars which are powered by electricity. So the share of car kilometres powered by electricity. And we think, in the evolving transition scenario, around 30% of total car kilometres will be powered by electricity in 2040. Now, the amount of cars, the amount of miles powered by electric cars depends on 2 things, both the number of cars and the intensity with which those cars are driven. About half of this 30% reflects the increasing number of electric cars. In this scenario, the number of electric cars grows from 3 million today to a little over 300 million by 2040. That's 300 million out of a total global car park in 2040 of about 2 billion, so about 15%. It's about half of that story. How confident, you may ask, are we about that 300 million estimate? Not the least bit confident. It could easily be 200 or 400 or 500. The good thing is, though, if it is wrong to that order of magnitude, the implications that has for oil demand are less than 1 or 2 million barrels a day of oil demand. So I'm not worried about that uncertainty, because when I think about the scale of it, it doesn't make a huge impact. If half of this is being done by the number of electric cars, the other half is being done by the increasing intensity with which those electric cars are being used. And the key driver here is autonomous vehicles. And so when you're thinking about the game changer, what's one of the really big game-changing features of this world is the growth of autonomous cars. So what I'm talking about here, for those who follow this strand of work, I'm talking about stage 4 or stage 5 fully autonomous cars. For those of you who don't follow this, think about cars which don't have steering wheels in, where you sit back and do your emails or help your daughter with their maths homework as you drive her to school, rather than have the steering wheel. We think fully autonomous cars will start to become available in the early 2020s and will gradually grow from there. But the key part, or the key point of our thinking at the moment, is that the cost of those autonomous vehicles will be so high at first most families and individuals won't be able to afford those cars, but rather they will be, vast majority will be sold to fleet services who provide shared mobility services. So think Uber or Lyft or Didi, of car fleet services providing shared mobility services. What's significant about that, if we walked out of the street today and we got into an Uber which didn't have a driver in, the cost of that journey would be about 40 or 50% less than the current cost. When you look at the margin, the operating cost of those taxi journeys, the driver accounts for around half of the cost. If the cost of using those services falls very dramatically, then you're likely to see a very dramatic rise in the use of it. Rather than taking a private car or a public bus, are increasingly use some form of autonomous shared mobility. And that's what you're seeing on the right here, in those light blue bars growing up here. A very significant rise in the proportion of car miles driven by fully autonomous shared mobility cars. Now, the link to electric cars is the cost of driving an electric car per mile is far, far cheaper than the cost of driving an internal combustion engine car. So we think the economics means that the vast majority of these shared mobility, fully autonomous, intensely driven cars will be electric cars. And that's what drives the intensity in terms of the intensity effect on the left-hand side. We think in this scenario, electric cars are driven a little over twice as much as internal combustion engine cars. And as a result of which, they squeeze out the amount of miles which would have been driven by internal combustion engine cars or buses. And as a result of which, in this scenario, 30% of cars is produced by electricity. So do I believe electric cars will grow rapidly? Yes, from 3 to 300 million. Moreover, I think the intensity of those cars are likely to be double that of an internal combustion engine car, driven by this autonomous effect. I should say, how confident am I about the timing of that autonomy? Again, not the least bit confident about the timing of that autonomy. Huge uncertainty there. Quite easily could be 5 or 10 years later than I've predicted here. It's quite hard for it to be 5 or 10 years earlier than I predicted, because that's sort of now, and it's not happening now. And as some of the crashes seen and accidents seen over the last few weeks, we know it's not happening in real time now. So this is a story of rapid growth in electric cars and rapid growth in the use of electric cars. So for a company like BP, this is hugely exciting. The implications this has for oil demand, despite this very sort of rapid use and growth, is relatively trivial. Relative to a story where we had no growth in electric cars and no growth in the use of electric cars, this reduces oil demand by around 2 or 3 million barrels a day. So for those of you who are not familiar with sort of oil demand, today the world will consume about 95 million barrels a day of oil. Tomorrow it will grow by about 95 million barrels a day of oil. As hundreds of millions of families in China and India are able to buy their first motor car and their first motorbike, that is likely to rise to significantly over 100 million barrels a day as we go out to 2040. This growth in electric cars reduces it by 2 or 3 million barrels a day. That's not modelling, that's not sort of deep economic theory, that's almost arithmetic. It's just a matter of just adding up the numbers, and the numbers aren't huge. Now, the problem with this type of analysis, if you're BP, is people say, yeah, but you're BP, you're bound to underestimate this. You sell oil, so I'm not going to trust you, because you're BP. Why should I trust you? So let me pick a scenario, a really extreme scenario for electric cars to sort of get a sense about what implications it may have. Okay, so what this scenario does, it says, consider a world where there's a global ban on the sale of all internal combustion engine cars. So internal combustion engine, ICE, ICE cars. So we call this the ICE ban. And in fact, to make this really difficult, not only do we ban the sale of all internal combustion engine cars by 2040, we also ban the sale of any plug-in hybrid cars by 2040. So the only car anywhere in the world that can be sold anywhere from 2040 onwards is a battery electric car. And moreover, we introduced this quite aggressively. So as you can see on the left-hand side here, by 2030, 30% of all cars in the world are battery electric cars sold. 2/3 of sales by 2035, 100% of sales by 2040. This equates to well over 1 billion electric cars on the planet. You won't find any serious projection anywhere in the world which is giving you anything close to 1 billion electric cars on the planet by 2040. This is a fairly extreme scenario, but it's a useful one to sort of think through what the implications may be. In this scenario, the world electric cars account for around 2/3 of all car miles by 2040. For those of you scratching your head thinking, hold on, if he's banned the sales of all internal combustion engine cars by 2040, why isn't it counting for 100%? That's because some cars which would have been sold before 2040 exist and will remain in the car fleet for a period of time and will carry on counting for some miles. And that's important to remember when thinking about the pace of transition here. Machines like cars stick around for a long time, so it reflects the pace at which some of these changes can happen. So what implications does this have on oil demand? Shown here in the next chart. On the left-hand side here, the impact of this relative to that evolving transition scenario, oil demand in this ice band scenario is around 10 million barrels a day less than in the evolving transition scenario. It reduces oil going into the car fleet by around a half. But in the evolving transition scenario, oil demand rose by close to 15 million barrels a day. So if oil demand grows by 10 million barrels a day less, this is still consistent with the level of oil demand in 2040 still being higher than the level today, even in a world where there's 1 billion electric cars on the planet. The suggestion that the rapid growth of so people say electric cars will grow rapidly. I agree. I think they'll grow really rapidly. My central case about 300 million. That's more than triple that to over 1 billion in this case. They then go on to say they will grow rapidly, and as a result of which they will lead to a rapid fall in oil demand. That is just not borne out by the arithmetic. In this scenario here, in a world where you have over 1 billion electric cars on the planet, that's consistent with the level of oil demand in 2040 still being higher than it is today. We published this over 6 weeks ago. This has been extensively peer-reviewed by many people. Nobody's pulled this apart because there's almost no modelling here, no assumptions here. This is almost entirely arithmetic. The chart on the right poses a question that, okay, so perhaps it doesn't do much to oil demand, Spencer, but how much does it do to carbon emissions? How does it help in terms of carbon emissions? So the way to read this chart, the blue line here shows carbon emissions in the evolving transition scenario that I was talking about. And in that scenario, carbon emissions rise by about 10%. That contrasts here with a scenario, this alternative scenario I've put on here, which we've called the even faster transition scenario. So perhaps not the catchiest of names, but my even faster transition scenario you can think about as a scenario consistent with achieving the Paris 2-degree goals. And what that says is that rather than rising by 10%, carbon emissions need to fall by something closer to 50%. So this gap between the plus 10 and the minus 50 gives you a sense of the gap that needs to be closed in order for us to get on a path consistent with hitting the Paris climate goals. So how much of that gap does this ice ban, 1 billion electric cars on the planet, do? How much does it close the gap? Almost nothing, shown by the green bars here. Rather than rising by 10%, it rises by 7%. A reduction of oil demand of 10 million barrels a day does not move the dial in terms of carbon emissions. There may be many reasons for promoting electric vehicles in terms of improving urban air quality, in terms of reducing particulates in the atmosphere, but in terms of carbon emissions, it literally doesn't move the dial. And so when you're sitting with politicians, wherever, in whatever part of the world you're sitting with, and if they're extolling the virtues of electric cars, and they're saying that to help with carbon emissions, stop them and show them this chart, and show how by putting 1 billion cars, electric cars on the planet by 2040, it does almost nothing to carbon emissions. And I should say, when drawing this chart, to make it really simple and clear, I assumed that all the electricity that was needed to power these electric cars was produced by renewable energy, and so didn't lead to any increases in carbon emissions. If I'd actually had an estimate of what the actual carbon emissions would do based on the average carbon intensity of the power sector, there would be almost, the blue and the green lines would almost be imperceptibly different. So I had to assume the renewable ones just to show you a difference in the two lines. So electric cars are happening, and they're growing rapidly, but their implications for oil demand and for carbon emissions, even in a really, really extreme scenario, are really quite limited. I will be amazed if when I sit down and do the question and answer session, somebody doesn't want to criticise some of that stories. Okay, so that was my first question. I want to go on to the second question, which is when will oil demand peak? When will it stop growing? The simple answer is, I don't know. And I think that's one point to take away. If you're with an economist or with a commentator or with an oil company executive who does know when oil demand will peak, don't believe them, because we don't know when oil demand will peak. Let me start with one scenario. I'll show you one scenario, just a way of showing you what the factors are, and then I'll show you a range of other factors. So this is oil demand in that evolving transition scenario. The left-hand side shows the level of oil demand, and the right-hand side the growth rate of oil demand. And you can see in the evolving transition scenario, oil demand is expected to continue to rise for much of the outlook, but the pace of that increase gradually declines through time, such that in the last 5 years of the outlook, oil demand starts to decline. The key driver of that declining growth is a slowing stimulus or slowing impulse from transportation, shown here in blue. The world continues to travel, demand for freight services continues to grow rapidly, but the planes, trains and automobiles that we use to do that transportation services gets more and more efficient. This is an efficiency-driven story. And so as a result, oil demand gradually slows, and in the last 5 years in this story is starting to decline. Now the pace of that decline in the last 5 years is very low. It's very small. So the cumulative decline over that 5-year period is less than 1 million barrels a day of oil demand. So about half the growth we saw in oil demand last year. So rather than peak oil demand, think plateau. But this is just one particular scenario for oil demand. We know the world won't look like that, so we should look at a range of other scenarios. This shows you 4 different scenarios for oil demand, the level of oil demand. The blue one, the top blue one, is the evolving transition scenario that we just looked at, with the level of demand continuing to rise until about 2035 and then starting to decline. The next one down, in light green, is the level of oil demand in my ice band, the one we just talked about, 1 billion cars on the planet. In that scenario, the level of oil demand peaks in about 2030, but the level of oil demand, as I said, in 2040 is still higher than the level today. The orange line, the bottom orange line, is the level of oil demand consistent with that even faster transition scenario I was just looking at. So, which is, as I said, is a scenario consistent with achieving the Paris climate goals. So even in a world And in that scenario, the level of oil demand starts to decline in around the mid-2020s. But even in that scenario, the level of oil demand in 2040 is around 85 million barrels a day of oil. If you looked at the International Energy Agency's, the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, which is also consistent with 2 degrees C, their level of oil demand in 2040 is about 80 million barrels a day, so pretty similar to this. The point here is these have 4 charts where the pace of the level of the timing of that peak oil demand ranges from sort of 2025 to 2035. It could be even later. So point number 1, I don't know when oil demand will peak. Point number 2 is I don't care. To a first order approximation, these lines are flat. Nobody expects oil demand to grow rapidly over the next 20 years. Nobody expects it to decline rapidly over the next 20 years. For those of you from engineers or mathematics, why do we care, if you think about the first derivative, why do I care when if the first derivative of oil demand is plus 0.1 or minus 0.1? It's not a big number on the way up, it's not a big number on the way down. To a first order approximation, this is a flat line. Why do we obsess about whether the first derivative is positive or negative? To put that in context, this dotted line here is a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is, suppose the entire world was to stop investing in new oil production today. We just put a complete moratorium on any new investment in any new oil production from today onwards. And we assumed that existing oil facilities declined at an annual decline rate of 3%. Now, 3%, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a relatively conservative estimate, but it's fine for this story. Even just with a 3% decline rate, the level of oil production in 2040 will be around 40 to 45 million barrels a day. This difference between what the world would be able to produce if it stopped investing in oil and all these demand scenarios tells me in almost any scenario I can think about, the world would need significant amounts of new investment in oil production over the next 20 or 30 years in order to provide the world the oil it needs in 2040. And if you like, relating this back to the strategy of BP and how we use it in our own strategy, the message I took from this scenario is, or this analysis is, I don't know what the level of oil demand will be in 2040. It may be 85, 95, 105 million barrels a day of oil. But I'm pretty certain it will be more than 45 million barrels a day of oil. And so BP, our strategy is continue to invest in oil, but only invest in low-cost, competitive oil. That relates back to that earlier story I was telling you in terms of that increasing abundance of energy and that increasing competitive environment. Just investing in any oil may have been fine 15, 20 years ago when you thought there was a scarcity of oil. In a world of abundance, you've got to make sure that you're only investing in low-cost, competitive oil. And so BP's sort of strapline, if you like, our headline for strategy for oil is continue to invest in oil, but only competitive, low-cost oil. And that's the story here. So that was the second question. How am I doing? I'm doing. We may be able to get through all 3 of these questions. Let's see if we can get through all 3 of these questions. So the next question was how will key LNG markets evolve and how some of these issues playing out. So just in terms of overall gas demand, this just shows you the level, levels of gas demand both by industry and by different regions. As I said, we expect gas demand to grow robustly over the next 25 years, far more quickly than either oil or coal. That's underpinned by broad-based demand, with strong demand in both the power sector and also within industry. Much of that growth coming from, you can see in the chart, from developing economies. The other sort of exception to that is significant growth within the US in gas demand, where the availability of low-cost gas supplies means that gas crowds out coal within the US economy. a key feature allowing this growth of gas demand, particularly in some economies like China and India, is the continuing growth of LNG and liquefied natural gas. We expect LNG exports, shown here on the left, to more than double over the next 25 years, with about 40% of that growth happening in the next 5 years as a whole series of projects in Australia and the US in particular, which are currently in flight, are completed and gradually come on stream. Looking ahead to 2040, we think the two major forces of growth of LNG, or the dominant sources of LNG supplies by 2040, will be the US, shown here in that light green, and also the Middle East, particularly Qatar. Qatar has enormous resources of low-cost gas and is likely to increase, and has already announced that it's likely to increase its exports quite substantially into the future. In terms of the demand side, shown here on the right, Asia is a key source, remains a key source of this growth of LNG demand, with strong growth in China and other developing Southeast Asian economies, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as India, shown here. One particular story, which I think we've discussed, some of us have discussed this in the past, is how will this play out in different markets. And I think what I'm going to do is just focus on one of these markets today, which is how will the role of LNG play in terms of meeting the import needs of Europe. And the reason why this is an important question is because this is a key marketplace, or a key area of competition between the growth of global LNG supplies versus the growth of pipeline exports from Russia. So to set the scene, in 2016, this chart shows you, the height of this chart shows you the level of gas consumption in Europe, and then it shows you what the sources of that demand was. So the red shows domestic production. So in 2016, around half of the growth half of the gas consumption in Europe was met by domestic production, and the rest was imported, with the majority of that imported gas coming in the purple here from pipeline exports from Russia. If we look ahead out to 2040, we expect the level of gas demand in Europe to remain broadly similar, but the amount of gas produced domestically to gradually decline as those fields mature, such by 2040, almost 75% of the gas that Europe consumes will be imported. So the question here is, how will those bars be filled in? How much of that will carry on being supplied by Russian pipeline exports, and how much will be met by this growing availability of LNG? In terms of competition, the answer to that should be straightforward. In terms of competition, pure competitive pressures, Russia should win hands down. It has huge reserves of low-cost gas, and it has massive pipelines going into Europe. It is very hard for anybody anywhere in the world to compete against that. Even if you have access to low-cost gas in America, as soon as you liquefy it, that roughly doubles the cost of that gas, and you still then have to pay the cost of that transportation. So in terms of pure competitive pressures, then the whole of this bar should be filled in by that Russian pipeline gas and some pipelines from other parts of neighbouring countries. But the factor which is governing the ability for Russia to export gas at the moment to Europe is not competitive pressures, it's concerns about energy security pressures. So roughly about a third of the gas which Russia, of total gas that Europe consumes today, is imported from Russia. And when I go to Brussels, there's the concern. They say, well, I'm worried, Spencer, about increasing my imports from Russia because of the energy security risk, being dependent on one source. What's interesting, though, that last year, Europe imported a third of the gas it consumed from Russia, but it imported over 40% of the oil it consumed from Russia. Nobody in Brussels says to me, Spencer, I'm really worried about the energy security issue of all this oil I'm importing from Russia. Nobody mentions it at all. Why? I think the answer to that is it's because there's a global market for oil. And so their point is, if anything were to happen to those oil supplies from Russia, it's okay, because I can go to the global market and find it somewhere else. So I'm not, although I buy a lot of my oil from Russia, I'm not dependent on it because there's a global market. Well, guess what? There's now a global market for gas, driven by the growth of LNG. And so as long as Europe has the ability to access that LNG market, that should allow it to be relaxed and consume more and more of its gas from Russia. So in this particular scenario here, what I've assumed is that Russia's share of total imports stays roughly the same. And as those imports rise, that ends up with Russia accounting for around 50% of total gas, of Europe's total gas consumption. Now, it may be that 50% is a little bit too far. Oil at the moment is a little over 40. The point here is, though, and I think this is well understood in Brussels, if they invest in LNG facilities, import facilities around key parts of the coast, around some of that west coast and also in the Baltics, and in addition solve the interconnected problems across different parts of Europe so they generally have a single market for gas, at that point they can leave those facilities largely unused and enjoy the benefits of being able to import cheap gas from Russia. As somebody pointed out to me, the sort of slight irony here is the growth of US LNG exports ends up allowing Russia to sell more gas to Europe rather than less. Or put another way, in Russia, at face value you may think of LNG as being a bad thing, as being increasing the competition. I think of it as the complete opposite. The competition, you win. The real thing which stops you from exporting more and more are energy security concerns, and the growth of LNG allows you to mitigate those energy security concerns by developing a global market for gas, and that's what we've assumed here. Okay, I'm going to speed up. I'm going to miss this one. Is a transition to a lower energy carbon system happening fast enough? You saw the answer to that in terms of that EV ban. Just to show you again here, the answer on the left is no. In that evolving transition scenario, the path which we think the world is on, given the sort of current momentum absent a shock, we have carbon emissions growing by over 10%. And as I said, looking across the literature, the sort of consensus is you need carbon emissions to be falling closer to 50% in order to achieve the Paris climate goals. So we need a more decisive break for the past if we're going to shift ourselves off the blue line onto something like the orange line. On the right-hand side here, the even faster transition scenario is one particular scenario that gets us on this path, where we use a combination of carbon pricing within the power sector plus increasing regulation in other sectors to promote energy efficiency and also switch to cleaner carbon fuels. I think it's fair to say at this point we're getting to the limits of our modelling capabilities in BP. So I don't think there's anything special about my particular scenario, and I often compare my 2-degree scenario with a number of other scenarios to get a sense about the different sort of differences. So what I'll try and bring out here is sort of common features across a range of 2-degree scenarios. What matters for me is less the policy levers which are being pulled and more what does this mean for the global energy system. If we look here at the chart on the right and look at the even faster transition column, which is the column to the extreme right here, overall energy demand still grows in this system, in this scenario, but less quickly than in the past, less quickly than the evolving transition scenario, reflecting greater improvements in energy efficiency. All of the growth in energy in this scenario is accounted for by growth in renewable energy, shown here in orange, with the share of renewable energy increasing to around a third by 2040. So that would be enormous. That would be a growth of renewable energy from 3% today to 30% by 2040. This would just be off the charts in terms of history. But even in that scenario, if renewable energy is accounting for around a third of energy in 2040, some other form of energy has to provide the other two-thirds as a matter of arithmetic. So even in a scenario consistent with meeting the 2-degree climate goals, oil and gas here, shown in the red and green, together provide a little over 40% of the world's energy. The level of oil demand is, as I said, it's about 80 million barrels a day, so about 10 million barrels a day lower than now. Then the level of gas demand is pretty much the same level as today, even in a 2 degrees scenario. The final point to bring out here is just a point on the left. In terms of comparing the evolving transition scenario, that blue line, in terms of getting from that blue line to the orange line, where is most of this action, the additional carbon abatement happening? Is happening in the power sector. And the reason why the power sector matters so much is because it absorbs about 50% of primary energy. It's a huge consumer of energy. And it's the one sector where all of these energies, renewable energy, coal and gas in particular, compete side by side. So relatively small shifts in relative prices can have very big impacts in terms of shifting to cleaner carbon fuels and reducing carbon emissions. So I have a sort of general rule. If I'm sitting with a politician and they want to talk about a serious programme of reducing carbon emissions, my general rule is I start by talking about the power sector, and then I'll talk about the power sector, and if I have any time left before the politician goes, I'll speak about the power sector some more. If you're speaking to politicians and they want to do something serious, don't be doing electric cars in terms of carbon emissions. Be thinking seriously about carbon emissions, because that is where the action is. Very final question, what does all this mean for Russia? And then I will stop and hand over for questions. This chart here just looks at, first of all, the sort of overall growth of energy in Russia over the next 25 years, which is built into this evolving transition scenario. We've assumed an average growth of GDP of around 1.5% or so. And I should say up front here, almost everybody in this room will know far more about Russian energy than I. So this was not meant to be a detailed study of Russian energy. This is what we've built into Russia in the context of this broad global story. So 1.5% of growth of GDP, with energy demand growing by about 0.2, 0.3% a year. The difference between those two, improvements in energy efficiency. If anything, that improvements in energy efficiency is less than the average seen across other parts of the world, even though Russia starts with a significantly higher level of energy intensity. So my hunch is, if this is wrong, the risk is that the improvements in energy intensity will be greater, and therefore the overall growth in energy demand will be even less. What's interesting about the chart on the right is, relative to almost any other economy, is how stable this fuel mix is. And also the pattern of that fuel mix looks very different. Gas accounts for around 50% of energy in Russia, very different to the global fuel mix, and looks pretty stable going forward. We expect the coal share to gradually decline over time. Arithmetically, that's happening, I think, largely because of increases in both some increases in both renewable energy and nuclear energy, crowding out coal within the power sector. Also, we have demand within the industrial sector, which is very particularly coal intensive, growing particularly weakly over this scenario. I have some charts comparing Russia with America. I'm going to stop, otherwise I won't have time for questions. But if people want to ask about how does Russia compare to America, I'll come back to the podium and do some questions about that. But I'm conscious about not having time for Q&A. So let me stop there and hand over. And to remind you, and just to remind you again, we do this and present this partly to engage with people, but as I said, to find out which bits are wrong. So in terms of the Q&A, do feel free, as well as asking questions, to point out which bits of the analysis you didn't find very convincing. Thank you very much.